Hi everyone, my name is Renata Coke Alvarenga. I'm a gender and climate justice youth advocate from Brazil, and today I will talk to you a little bit about climate justice and the intersection between gender, human rights, and climate change. So, to start off, just to introduce myself, as I said, I'm from Brazil. I have a bachelor's degree in international relations from Unicinos, which is a university in the south of Brazil, in Porto Alegre, where I'm from. And I also studied some years in my undergraduate studies at Seton Hall University in the US. I'm a political analyst in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil, working with domestic politics. And I'm the founder and director of Empodera Clima, which is a gender and climate justice educational platform at the nonprofit Care About Climate. I'll explain a little bit more about the work that we do at Empodera Clima in just a bit. But before I do that, I wanted to start off by talking a little bit about what climate justice is and the key concepts around it, including ecofeminism, intersectionality, and a few others that center the conversations around climate justice and center the work that I do and that our team does at Empodera Clima specifically. So this is a quick and brief description of what climate justice is. If you have ever heard of Mary Robinson, she was the former president, the first woman president of Ireland, and also the High Commissioner of Human Rights at the UN back in the 90s. And she is a big advocate for climate justice. She has this foundation called the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, and this is their definition for this very complex but yet important concept. And it says that climate justice links human rights and development to achieve a human centered approach, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable people and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and its impacts equitably and fairly. So basically, it's looking at the global challenge of climate change through this human centered lens or this human approach, which means taking into account the people that are most affected, but also their leadership, which I'll explain a little bit more in some detail. But I think that the first thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about climate change, we have to think about who are the people who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And that means considering the disproportionate effect of climate change and the climate crisis in different people, in different regions of the world, in different areas, such as rural areas, indigenous lands, areas near island states, for example. So the inequalities in those different areas are really, really important. And of course, when you take into account the marginalized groups in society, you notice the burden that they have in terms of vulnerability, in terms of the effect that they feel because of all of the impacts of climate change, such as droughts, floods, and all of the other things that you can think of, such as sea level rise, for example. So this is a picture that those are pictures that illustrate this quite well, and specifically the gender aspect of it. And the whole idea is that for women, for example, when there are droughts in their communities, a lot of times in their families, because of the patriarchal societies that we live in, they're the ones that are responsible for walking miles and miles and miles to go find water for their families. In those situations of droughts. And a lot of times, because they're walking miles and miles to get that water, they're being subject to abuse in a few different ways, into violence, and especially when we're talking about younger women and girls, they're missing out on getting their education and going to school because they have that role in their societies because of patriarchy to get that water and complete that job as women in their families. So these are just some examples, but there's of course so many that you could relate to. And these maps are from this website called the Carbon Map, which basically outlines in terms of size of global maps the different responsibilities and vulnerabilities of different countries. And this is really important because when we talk about vulnerability, we're not just talking about people. Of course, we're talking about people, but we have to talk about the divide between the global north and the global south and consider those that have been historically emitting the carbon dioxide into our atmosphere. So in the map, at the top of the screen, you can see the historical responsibilities. And this is really an important term. The UN Climate Change Convention actually calls this the common but differentiated responsibilities. It's a pretty important concept in climate policy. And the whole idea is that those countries such as the United States or even a lot of countries within Europe have been emitting carbon dioxide for many, many years, whereas other countries such as emerging countries like Brazil and China have been doing that a little bit more recently. So there's a disproportionate effect in terms of historical emissions. But then again, when you think about poverty and the vulnerability related to that, you can see on the map at the bottom that a lot of Asia and Latin America and Africa, the African continent, are the most affected. And this is an important concept to think about and keep in mind when we're talking about climate action at the policy level, globally, but also nationally and locally in every action that we do to tackle the climate crisis. So I think it's important to mention that, of course, we have to think about the vulnerability side of things, but leadership is really, really important to be considered. And when we're talking about women specifically, we can consider all of the statistics and the data out there that talk that when you have more women in government, you have more climate friendly agreements, more climate friendly actions. And these are just some stats up there on the screen, which say that when we have women parliamentarians, women in Congress, women in parliaments, they tend to prioritize social issues a little bit more than men. And therefore, countries that have the largest female or feminist representation have more chances of ratifying environmental treaties and agreements and policies. So this is quite interesting to keep in mind when we're thinking about why it's important to have gender balance, for instance, in decision-making spaces, in high-level spaces. And another stats that's written over there as well is that there's more protection of forests when there are women in executive committees. So this could also correlate to boards, executive boards in companies and the private sector as a whole. So not just in public policy, in the public sector, but overall when we have more gender balance and more equitable structures. And of course, here we have to mention a few other concepts such as class, race, age, which I'm going to mention in a few minutes. It's proven that we have more justice and more climate just treaties, agreements, policies. So something to really keep in mind of when we're talking about climate justice. And these are just a few pictures showing feminist leadership. Those are some pictures to my left of women in the Marcha das Margaridas, which is a pretty important march about indigenous women in Brazil and rural women fighting for their rights. And to my right, you can see the pictures of the protests and the actions that took place at COP25, the UN Climate Conference in Spain in 2019, where feminist groups were demanding climate justice. And you can see there's a lot of public engagement for that. So I think it's just really important to mention. And of course, this is where I want to get at, which is this concept called ecofeminism. It centers a lot of the work that we do at Empodera Clima and the work that the climate justice groups do all around the world. And the whole idea here is that there's a parallel between environmental degradation and the structures of power around that, around nature, and the exploration of women as well. So when we talk about gender inequalities, gender-based violence, and then when we also talk about issues around nature and around destroying nature, destroying Mother Earth, this is what ecofeminism correlates. And it's quite an interesting concept. And one of the biggest scholars and researchers and spokespeople about ecofeminism is Vandana Shiva, who's in this picture right there. She's from India and she's a really, really big voice. So I suggest that you definitely read some of her articles and books and research about ecofeminism, because it is really enlightening to see how those two topics, nature and feminism and women, fit together, and it makes a lot of sense. So I recommend that you check it out. The other concept that I've mentioned a few times before now, but I think it's really important to highlight specifically, is intersectionality. So this is a term that was coined in the 1980s in the United States by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's this amazing, inspiring academic from the US. And she wrote about how different forms of social injustice interact with one another. And basically, for example, when we're talking about climate change, we can think that women are, yes, vulnerable to climate change, but when you take into account other social inequalities such as age, level of poverty, ethnicity, race, things like that, and of course, sexual orientation, then you were met with additional burdens to climate change or to anything that you can think of in terms of policymaking. So it's really, really crucial that when we're talking about climate action and about climate policies, you need to take into account intersectionality as a key term to everything you do. So now that we're done talking a little bit about the concepts of climate justice, I wanted to move into gender in the climate negotiations. I've been attending the climate negotiations of the UN for the past 5 years. I attended COP21, COP25, some other smaller negotiations. And it's really interesting to see the development and the growth of the gender subject within those negotiations at the global level. So I just wanted to highlight a few over here. So you can see on the graph that there's the percentage of women heads of delegations. So when there are conferences such as the COPs, which are the supreme body of the UN Climate Change Convention that discusses climate action. And the Paris Agreement came from one of those conferences, COP21 in 2015. So it's really important that we analyze and consider the percentage of women's leadership in the delegations, so in country delegations that attend the COPs, but also in civil society, in the private sector, in cities, all kinds of stakeholders, because it's only then that we're going to be able to mainstream gender at all levels. So as you can see on the graph, there's the percentage of women attending those COPs, especially in purple, that's the percentage. But when you also take into account the intersessionals, which are the technical conferences of the UN that happen throughout the year, leading up to the COP at the end of the year, it's also interesting to see because there's a higher percentage of women heads of delegation at the intersessionals at the technical level, but not so much at the COPs, at the UN climate conferences, annual conferences that are, as I said, the supreme bodies of the UN Climate Change Convention. And it's interesting to see, for example, the drop in 2015, which was precisely the year that passed the Paris Agreement, the most ambitious and largest global agreement for climate action that we have nowadays. So it's interesting to see the dynamics and the proportionalities when you think about women's leadership. And I've highlighted in this slide as well a little bit about the actions that have been taken in the past at the global level to improve the gender discussions at the climate policy level. So the Lima Work Program on Gender was this huge framework, ambitious framework about how to implement gender in the negotiations, and that was back in 2014. But over the past few years, there have been more discussions about what exactly there could be, what kind of document there could be that could set the priorities of all of the parties of the UN Climate Change Convention to commit to gender mainstreaming in climate action. And that's where the Gender Action Plan, also called the GAP, comes in 2017. And since then, there has been an enhanced or an improved version of it published, which was at COP25 in 2019 in Spain. And I think this is really important to mention. I feel like a lot of times civil society organizations or other types of stakeholders haven't heard of the Gender Action Plan because it is still quite small and it's not legally binding. So I think that's also important to note. But it's an important action of the UN Climate Change Convention to make sure that within the work that they do at the global level, gender is a key aspect, a key priority of their agendas. So it's a super, super important mechanism. And of course, there's the Paris Agreement in itself, which, as I said, it's the most ambitious climate agreement that we've had in the past few years. And in its preamble of the Paris Agreement, there's mention to climate justice, to women's empowerment, to feminist action for climate justice, and a few other terms. So this is, even though it's a very small feat, because it's only in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, it's also important to recognize the importance of having those types of wordings, such as women's empowerment and climate justice, in such a big and global agreement that's signed by 197 countries, 197 parties of the UN climate change. So it's a pretty big feat of the global climate discussions. So a little bit more on the Gender Action Plan, also called the GAP, as I mentioned. there's 5 priority areas about it, and they are basically what guides the gender action plan and what guides the activities that happen around it. So as you can see, there's a lot of focus to capacity building, knowledge management, and communication. So this is a lot about providing training. So for example, providing training for country delegations that go to these COPs and go to these climate conferences to know how they can have more gender balance in their internal delegations, but also how they can have gender mainstreaming in their policies. And all of the priority areas mention that a little bit, but the first one mentions specifically capacity building and how the Secretariat of the UN Climate Change Convention can provide tools for organizations and countries to commit to gender balance and gender equality a little bit more than they are doing now. So priority area B is also talking about gender balance, but specifically about women's leadership. So that graph that I mentioned beforehand about the percentage of women who are and were heads of delegation in their countries for these climate conferences is still pretty low comparing to men's leadership. So that's why this is one of the priorities of the Gender Action Plan. And the other ones here, I'm not going to go too much into detail, but it talks about coherence. So for example, thinking about the 2030 agenda of the United Nations for sustainable development, it's important that there's coherence around that. So it's important that, for example, Sustainable Development Goal number 13, which talks about climate action, also thinks about climate justice and also takes into account gender balance. So having that coherence across different UN systems, different multilateral treaties like the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda of the United Nations is super, super important. Other ones are talking about implementation, gender responsive implementation, and that means gender responsive implementation basically means taking into account the gender aspect in any policy that you implement, whether that is on climate mitigation, climate adaptation, loss and damage. It's important that gender justice is a key part of all of that. And finally, priority area E, the fifth one, is about monitoring and reporting. So taking that accountability aspect of policy discussions and making sure that the gender action plan, even though it's not precisely legally binding, it's also important that it is there's constant reports and monitoring to see where countries are in terms of gender balance and mainstreaming in their climate action points and climate policy. So these are just some stats that you can take a while going through it. I would also suggest that you take a look into the source that I put over there, which is the Women's Environmental and Development Organization, also known as WEDO. It's this amazing organization in the United States, and they create a lot of content and they track a lot of the participation of women in the climate conferences, whether that is in the intersessionals, at the actual COPs, or other conversations around climate justice and climate action. So you can see just some stats over there. For example, especially when you think about the growth of that. So as I mentioned the Gender Action Plan, I mentioned the Paris Agreement, I mentioned the Lima Work Program on Gender. All of those were implemented in the last 10 years, not even the most the oldest one of those that I mentioned is from 2014. So in 2021, it would be 6 years that it was implemented. 7 years now, basically. And it's interesting to think that while we have had all of this progress, it has been very recently. So it goes to show that these discussions on gender and justice weren't happening just a few years back, a few decades back. And you can see the difference between 2009 and 2019 in these graphs. Whereas, for example, in terms of women's participation in national delegations of countries, their representation was of 32% in 2009, whereas in 2019 it was at 39%. So we increased a good amount of just a few percentage points, just 7%. But of course, there's a longer way to go because we want gender balance. We want 50-50 because, of course, women make up 50%, over 50% of the population. So why are we not represented in that percentage at the climate negotiations, which are so key to our present and our future as humans and as human beings, as people. So just wanted to really highlight that. And you can also see the percentage of heads of delegations, which I also showed in the other graph. So in 2009, we were at 10%. And then in 2019, we were at 21%. So again, there was basically double of the number, which is really great, but 21% of women in terms of heads of delegations at COPs is really concerning and is really just not nearly enough of where we want to be at. And this goes back to that idea, which is about when we have more women in parliament, women in leadership, we have more climate friendly agreements. So it's important to take that into account when we see those statistics, and then when we consider the results of the climate conferences, and when we consider the Kyoto Protocol, for example, which many considered a failure, and thinking about what was the percentage, for example, of women in those delegations back then, back in 1997. So these are just some food for thought items and ideas that I think could help explain a little bit more about where we are, what's the status of the climate negotiations, and where we could be at if we had gender balance. So that's a little bit of a summary about gender in the negotiations and gender and climate justice as a whole. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about the project that I lead, that I mentioned before, which is Empodera Clima. For those that know Spanish or Portuguese, it stands for Empower for Climate. This is our webpage, our main webpage, where you can visit at empoderaclima.org. And as it says here, we empower youth in the global south to learn about the impacts of climate change on women and the role of gender equality. So the whole idea is that when I was attending those conferences many years ago, I couldn't find a lot of information in my language, in Brazilian Portuguese, about gender and climate change, or even in other languages like Spanish or French. It was the majority of those documents and discussions were in English. So I see that there was a gap there, and therefore, because I believe that education empowers people to take action, when we don't have access to a lot of those documents, we're not able to empower ourselves as young people, for example, to take action for climate justice and know those mechanisms that I just mentioned, like the Gender Action Plan and the Paris Agreement, and know where we as youth can interfere into making sure they're ambitious in terms of justice. So Empodera Clima does just that, and we actually have a database which you can see a picture of here, of research documents, videos, and podcasts that we compile from all over the internet, all over the place, many different countries. And there you can find more content and more information about gender and climate in 4 different languages. So we work with English, Portuguese, Spanish, and French specifically, so we can reach young people from all over Latin America and the Caribbean, the African continent as well, for those that are French-speaking countries, and just other countries that maybe don't have as good as of an access to gender and climate content. And then through this platform, they can research that. And in the past 2 years, we've also added a lot of original content, so you can find articles on a bunch of different topic areas concerning gender and climate, including gender and climate in forests, in the Amazon rainforest, for example, gender and climate in vegetarianism and the veganism movements. So it's very interesting to see how broad this topic reaches. And if you're working in climate justice, if you're working with environmental science, if you're working with green technologies and green jobs, you can find a gender angle to all of that. Because again, because we're part of this patriarchal society and there's gender imbalance and gender inequalities all over the place, you can find ways to enhance that and ways to tackle gender inequalities by inputting that into your work or mainstreaming that into your work in whatever area that is, specifically as we're talking about here in green action, in climate action. And you can also submit your work. So we have youth that are part of our team from 6 or 7 different countries, but we accept submissions from people all over the world to get featured on our website, whether you have podcast that you did on gender and climate, or a video or a research document. Anything related to climate justice is acceptable. So please feel free to contribute with anything that you'd like in terms of content. We would be very happy to do that and to receive your submission. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is We also do a lot of advocacy work. So of course, we have this database, we have this educational work that we do, but we also try to influence the discussions. So I mentioned a lot about the negotiations. And for instance, we have a really good relation with the UN Climate Change Convention. We talk with their gender team to see how we can collaborate and increase the youth voice, because basically young people need to be a part of the table, now bringing that youth perspective, because we're the ones who are going to be facing the consequences of climate change in the next few years. This is going to be our reality, our kids' realities, our grandkids' realities. So it's important that we're part of the discussions happening now, such as the adoption of big things like the Paris Agreement. So within Empodera Clima, we try to take youth to as many discussions as we can. We attended COP25, and if you are interested in seeing what a COP conference looks like, for example, what it's like to attend, what kind of conversations are held at those really high-level conferences, you can go to our UN Climate Conference tab, and you find daily recaps that we wrote, for example, for COP25, and just see everything that happened around the discussions on human rights and how youth can get involved, basically. And one example of that is Yango. We are part of this group called Yango, which is the youth constituency of the UN Climate Change Convention. There's 9 constituencies to be more exact, of civil society groups and companies and municipalities and governments that take part in the UN climate discussions. But because they're not countries, there's alternative ways for them to get involved, and the youth movement is no exception. So Empodera Clima is part of that through the NGO that we are a part of, Care About Climate, and we're able to therefore influence a lot of those discussions and get our points across as youth involved in those negotiations. So these are just some content suggestions that I'd like to give. You can find more, as I said, on the Empodera Clima website. But I would really recommend that you take a look at this book by Naomi Klein called This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate, which talks a lot about climate justice, about those inequalities between countries, between the global south and the global north, which I mentioned way back in the beginning of this presentation. You can also take a look at the Mothers of Invention podcast if you do like podcasts, because this is a really great one and really funny one. It kind of mixes comedy with serious conversations about gender and climate, and it highlights a lot of women leaders, a lot of feminist leaders working for climate action. So I'd really recommend that one. And then finally, if you like the conversations around the negotiations and want to know how gender has been featured in more detail at these climate negotiations, you can check out the Pocket Guide to Gender Equality under the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC is basically the acronym for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's what we call it. And this pocket guide is about 100 pages long. It's super long, but I think it's a great resource for you to use in your research, or even if you want to do a talk about gender and climate in your university, school, whatever it is. I would say that those 3 content suggestions are a really great way to start and learn more about the climate justice movement, about how women are more affected, and why it's important that we have women leaders in those conversations. So that's it. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I hope you enjoyed learning more about the intersection between gender, human rights, and climate change and climate action, and about Empodera Clima, about the work that we do. So if you want to get involved, you can just contact us at info@empoderaclima.org. I put my Twitter over there, Renata Coke 9, where you can also reach out to me. And there's also an Instagram page for Empodera Clima, where we do a very fun and straightforward version of our content on the website. And you can learn more about all of the different intersections around gender and climate and other issues that are correlated, as I mentioned, as race, class, age, and different things. So thank you very much. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like, and I'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye.